Hello, and welcome to the Blue Shadow Podcast. Today we have our very first solo episode, and that is going to be our Final Fantasy VII Rebirth review. I'm very excited to talk about this game. I've been playing it for quite a while, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But I do want to first start out by saying this is a massive spoiler warning for the story, gameplay, anything is fair game for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth within this episode. So just be prepared if you haven't played it. Feel free to leave this be and come back and give it a listen if you have when you're done, or if you're still playing it. I would recommend finishing it first. But if you don't mind, or you have finished it and are excited to see what we have to say, then feel free to stick around. I want to start this review by explaining my relationship with Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy VII as a whole, to kind of situate where we are, or what my perspective on where I'm coming from all this at. So I want to start out by saying I did not play the original Final Fantasy VII. We got it. I kind of started playing it a little bit, but I'm not the biggest turn-based combat fan, and it didn't quite work for me. And I had only tried playing it after the remake, but we'll talk about that in a second. But the reason that I am even interested in any of this in the first place is that my wife is a massive Final Fantasy fan. She is really into Final Fantasy X, 15, 7, and 16. And she had started by getting me to try and play Final Fantasy 15, and I had tried it, and I didn't really love playing it. The combat I didn't really love, but I have, since trying it myself, watched her play the story, and I really did enjoy the story from that. I had then watched her play Final Fantasy VII Remake a little bit, and I was like, okay, this looks kind of nifty. I was kind of intrigued by the hybrid combat format that they had. The characters seemed interesting and fun, and so I started playing that myself, and I actually really, really enjoyed it. I thought the combat system was really fun. I really loved it. I did find the story incredibly confusing. I watched a recap video after I'd finished that game, still was confused. Learned about the story of the original game, still was confused, but kind of just let that roll off because I did enjoy it. I thought it was really good, but it wasn't one of my favorite games of all time. And then I did end up playing that intermission DLC. I thought that Yuffie was a fun addition. I really enjoyed just having more of that gameplay. And I knew she was going to be coming in the second game, and I was just excited to see her interact with the rest of the characters that we came to know and love through Remake. So that's my relationship with Final Fantasy VII, through Remake. And I did end up playing 16. I absolutely loved it. It's one of my favorite games I've ever played. I loved the characters, and Clive especially. I thought that his positivity and personality were really great. And I thought it was a foil to Cloud. I thought that Cloud was kind of one-dimensional in Remake, and that is something that I think has changed in Rebirth. With 16, I thought that the use of the summons as icons and really making them really important to the story was a great addition. And I loved the gameplay and combat. Though I thought the ending of the game was a little unsatisfying, I really loved the game itself. So I have played 7 Remake and Intermission, played 16 and loved it. And one exciting thing we did prior to actually playing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth was we got to see a re-release of Final Fantasy VII Advent Children, the movie, in theaters. It was really nifty that we were able to go and see it at an AMC theater. The story was a little odd, but it really highlighted how cool Final Fantasy VII action really could be. And it got me excited to revisit these characters and see where our story was really going. Not just with respect to the original game, but with respect to, the remake and the changes in way they're kind of playing with that in the new story. So getting me ready for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, I was pretty excited. I watched the trailers, but I wasn't like, oh my God, I'm going to just be so excited for this. I didn't play the demo. I was just not quite sure how to feel with the transition into a larger open world. I had played Remake in 2021, which was quite a while from now, obviously, and I had to refresh myself on the story and plot intricacies, which, as I mentioned, was kind of confusing to me. And I was worried that the story might confuse me further. And not to get ahead of myself, but it both did and didn't at the same time, which is kind of cool and exciting. We pre-ordered this game from GameStop, and I got an absolutely terrible trucker hat. It makes my head look like a baby. It makes it look like I'm wearing a baby's hat, but it was kind of nifty to get a little promotion. I haven't got a physical promotion for a game in quite a while. I had started playing on release day in February, so we're quite a ways off from that. And I was just at that point excited to see where the story was going and if we might get any answers. I kind of went into it very open, not like having any specific hopes. And I think that really got me to where I ended up feeling about this game. I want to talk about how I played Final Fantasy VII Rebirth a little. I am in graduate school and work full days, so I primarily played this game on the evenings and weekends, with a few exceptions where I had an off day and would play like a whole work day worth of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, which was pretty fun. But at the point of recording this, I've completed all the main story missions, all the side quests with the exception of the Chocobo Race side quest, and all the proto-relics, but the final set of them that are in the Meridian Ocean. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But I also did all the intel and world-related stuff too, which was, really fun. I had ignored some of the snaps and Chadley stuff. I did, enough Chadley stuff to get some cool materia, but that's kind of what I had left on the field. And this is why and the reason I say this is that it's taken me so long to complete and come at you with this, at this point, several months after release. But I am excited to provide a very thorough, in-depth, comprehensive review of my thoughts on the game, both in terms of the mechanics and of the story. So after doing everything that I had mentioned, my total playtime was about 85 hours, which is honestly a little shorter than I expected. I typically get platinum trophies on the games that I play, but I haven't done that for this game yet. It does seem really intensive, and I've seen people online take about 115 to 135 hours, depending on how much you struggle with some of the certain fights and whatnot. I don't know if it's necessarily in the cards for me with this game, at least at this point, but not something I'm ruling out. So now that I got kind of that introductory material out of the way, I want to tell you about how I'm going to structure this review. The first part of this is going to relate to gameplay. What did I think of everything related to actually playing the game? The second part is going to be a story recap. I'm going to try and, hit all the main points and go through the story, summarize it, and talk about some of my feelings as I'm going through it. And then finally, briefly, because as we'll see, the game is, pretty complex, I want to talk about some concepts that I'd like to see in the third game, and then, give my final thoughts. So as I mentioned, I'm going to start talking about the gameplay. I'm going to start with the graphics. I'm not really a huge technical gamer, but I love when games are visually impressive. On the PlayStation 5, there's so much potential. We have a nice 4K TV, so getting all of that, all that set up and then see something visually impressive is really rewarding. And Rebirth did this. It ticked all the boxes I was looking for. It was right up there with some of the best looking games, in my opinion, including Horizon Forbidden West and Ghost of Tsushima. It was that caliber, especially with the environments, I thought were really wonderful. And then there was the pre-rendered cutscenes, like the one at the very end of the game. And I thought those looked like borderline photorealistic, which is really, really cool to see. So graphically, I thought this was a wonderful game. Again, I'm not a huge graphics person. I just like to be visually impressed, and I was with this. I want to take a second and talk about combat, because they made some changes and updates that I thought really took this system, and just made little improvements that really helped it in the long run. As I've mentioned a little bit, I'm not a huge fan of turn-based combat. I really tend to not enjoy it, but I liked the hybrid combat of Remake, where you're kind of doing your typical standard action combat, but also being in menus, doing things like casting spells and whatnot. I thought this game, Rebirth, built on Remake's system in small but meaningful ways. Since the system was so well done, there was only minor things that could be improved. But one of the things they did was just adding new abilities. The ones that are linked to the different weapons. Some of my favorites were Tifa's Reverse Gale and Cloud's Firebolt Blade. I thought they complemented existing ones well. Like, you had all of your, throughout the game you acquired or started with all of the different abilities from Remake. But, getting those new ones to build into the arsenal, especially the ones that were imbued with different elemental aspects, I thought were really nifty. The largest change that they had made to the combat, and something that I had seen a whole lot of when the initial reviews for Rebirth came out, was synergy abilities and skills. I thought that these were the most substantial and the most amazing addition to this already stellar combat system. I think it added depth to something that was already there, and it allowed you to use characters in different ways where you might not have been able to previously. I loved that with synergy skills, which are the ones that didn't require any buildup. You just used it by holding in R1, I believe. I love that they had unlimited uses, and I thought it was a great way to improve on character weaknesses. The example that I used probably the most was Tifa and her synergy skill, Soaring Flurry, with Cloud. This is where Cloud would, launch Tifa into the air and get her airborne to fight airborne enemies. One of Tifa's major weaknesses in Remake, and then if this ability weren't present in Rebirth, is fighting against larger or aerial enemies. So this allowed you to position Tifa better against these types of enemies, and at no ATB cost. It was just a wonderful way to take a character that I play as a lot and use her in a way where she wouldn't have been used in Remake, for example. I found myself with the synergy skills, I often use more offensive skills. I tend to, when I play video games, not necessarily block as much, which might not be great, but I use more of the offensive skills than the counter-based ones. And I did want to talk about synergy abilities. I thought they were absolutely wonderful, and I thought they were each so unique and cool in the way that they paired the different characters together to do a really unique thing. And I also loved that they were able to, beyond having just a cool visual and do damage, they had a third aspect to it, where it, for example, would give you unlimited MP or, extend stagger, give you 3 MP or 3 ATB bars. I thought that was just a really interesting way to spice up the combat, give you ways to interact with the characters more, and give you a reason to combine characters in different ways to see, what might come from those synergy skills. I thought that was really wonderful. Again, we're in the combat section, so I wanted to talk about the combat party format in this game. When the combat party wasn't locked for story reasons, which it did, off and on, you can typically choose 3 party members to play as. Sometimes I wish that I could have had, a 4th party member here, because Cloud was always present in the party. And I know this harkens back to the original game, but Cloud was always present for these. And I felt like I love playing as Cloud and everything, but there are so many playable characters in this game that I feel like I didn't get to use them all as much as I'd like. And having a 4th party slot may have, helped me feel more like I was getting more people incorporated. But I understand that would have, done a lot of balancing changes with the game, made things easier potentially because you have more characters building ATB and whatnot. But that aside, I did enjoy the ability to switch out freely who was in your party. For me, my preferred combat parties were I started out as I did in Remake playing with Cloud, Tifa, and Barret primarily, but towards the end of the game I transitioned into Cloud, Tifa, and Yuffie. I thought Yuffie was one of the best characters in that. She's the only reason I beat some of the later characters with ease, using her ranged ability, building up ATB, and then continuing to do stuff along with the doppelganger ability was wonderful. I would periodically transition to add Red 13, but not as often. And I thought Cait Sith was interesting, but I didn't really play with him very often. And I often struggle with playing as Aerith. This happened in Remake. I struggled with Rebirth. But as the game kind of, challenged you to get better at playing with Aerith, I tended to, resist it at first. But I found myself getting a lot better and using her wards in really unique ways. And once you kind of crack the code with her, she was really fun to play as. I wanted to take a second and talk about progression for the characters and the weapons themselves. I thought that this was far more straightforward in this game. I really preferred this game's Magnata book system and skill tree in, using the vending machines rather than getting the orbit, like materia-looking orbiting system from Remake. I thought that was a little confusing and non-linear in terms of what I might need to do or even organization-wise. At first, I felt like the upgrades that you could get at these places, though, were kind of minor, with the exception of getting new synergy abilities. As I mentioned, when reviews started coming out for Rebirth, people were going on about how wonderful these synergy skills and abilities were, and I stand by the fact that those are wonderful, but they kind of led me to not pay much mind to what else was there. And some of the minor upgrades that I'm talking about were entering battle with a small amount of ATB, very basic elemental abilities for each character and whatnot. But as I moved through the game, especially towards the end of it, I realized that you had really powerful things that you could acquire from the skill tree. For example, new limit breaks, abilities, and stuff like that you wouldn't have no other means of getting. I wish I had the chance to use these abilities for each character, as I was only able to unlock a few for my first playthrough. And refunding and rebuilding characters kind of stresses me out with their XP. So I didn't do that yet, but I do want to revisit this upon a replay and get these abilities and these synergy skills for all the characters and limit breaks and all that to make sure that I'm not missing anything and, getting everything cool. Speaking of abilities, I did also want to talk about the weapon mastery system. This was something that was present in the last game, and I often, when I'm playing video games, get into a rut where once I find something I like and is working, I struggle to change things once I'm comfortable. Like I mentioned with the skill trees, like refunding and rebuilding makes me nervous. Once I find something that I like, I kind of tend to stick with it. But the weapon mastery system kind of forces you to, or gently encourages you, rather, to experiment with each weapon. And if you find you want to return to another one or go with a different one, you get your weapon ability from it, and then you're free to go back to whatever you'd like. For me, when I'm playing, I tend to prioritize having more materia slots, and generally as you go through the game, your weapons get more and more materia. One example of one I did not use is Cloud's Crystal Sword. This was found in the Gungaga Reactor mission. It has a high chance of critical hit abilities and all that, but it has some subpar stats and only a few materia slots, so I stayed away from that after I got the infinities and through the weapon mastery. I next wanted to talk about the open world gameplay. I tend to really love open world games. The Horizon franchise, Ghost of Tsushima, Insomniac Spider-Man, Infamous, Days Gone, Watch Dogs. I can continue going on about all the open world games that I absolutely love. And while I love each of these games, playing them has shown me that there are things that I both love and dislike about the open world format. From these games, I found that the most effective open world games do a few things. The first of those is have a fantastic main story that keeps you wanting more throughout the game. Without this fantastic main story, it's so hard to care about or enjoy doing any of the other content that the game puts forth. Rebirth does this really well because I always was tempted to go to the main story, but I also enjoyed everything else that I had the option to do. And that brings me to the second thing that effective open world games do, and that would be have meaningful side quests and additional content. Since side content is optional, it's so important to make players actually want to play it. While I said I always wanted to proceed with the main story previously, I did not because I genuinely enjoyed doing the side content. This is a very, very, very long game, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. And after doing side content for a while, I would eventually need to take a break from it, even if it meant not completing a region before leaving it. But I always enjoyed it. I really liked, gathering the intel and all of that stuff. But it just was... Final Fantasy VII Rebirth did a great job at having side content that wasn't too long, that gave you meaningful rewards, and you actually wanted to do. The last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of effective open world games is, since open world games often have specific areas, specific regions or, districts in a city or different islands or something, ensuring that enough time is spent in each area to allow the player to naturally encounter side content and, just do it on the way to something rather than having to feel like they're going out of their way to do this side stuff that they might not even want to. And say, for example, it's like, oh, this life spring in Rebirth is right over there. I might as well go do it since I'm passing it. For being such a large game, I thought that Rebirth did this surprisingly well for most of the regions. And the only exception that I had for this was the Gungaga region. Gungaga, it's challenged me in many different ways. It's a multi-layered maze that's quite challenging to navigate using the map. And while I love the appearance of the region and the story moments that happen there, I got quite frustrated when I was completing the side content in Gungaga because you don't spend much time in the actual story there, or the time you do spend is kind of sent in the reactor where you're, off in a place where you can't really encounter side quest. So since that time is kind of limited, it's really the first and only true time in this game where I had done hardly any of the side content of a region when I was technically supposed to leave it for the main story. And based on these reasons and, everything I had said about Gungaga previously, it was kind of a grind for me to finish. And it was the only time in this game, in my experience with this game, that I felt like I had to grind at all. So I think Rebirth largely did a really good job at kind of naturally delivering you to places where side content might be, and with the exception of Gungaga. And speaking of the map and the regions, I loved that each region had a unique appearance, a unique chocobo type with their own kind of gimmick, and key landmarks that really stood out. For example, the Junon or Under Junon region had so much character in times of it, being like a fishing town and, showing the diversity of things that occur there. And that goes to Calm too. Calm was a great place to start the game because it was, as the name kind of seems, calm, like a place where you might want to, go visit if you were in this world. My favorite of the regions was Corel because it had such incredible amount of diversity within the single region. Costa del Sol, it had the more tropical area, the Gold Saucer, desert buggy area where you could drive that buggy around. It was all in one region, and it was definitely super enjoyable to explore and complete all of the stuff there. One other thing that I really, 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 really loved about this game was the individual character spotlight chapters. So one of my favorite things to do in a video game is to periodically shift which character I'm playing as, particularly in a story game. In previous eras, like around the PS3, PS4, which is where I spent most of my early gaming time, this was pretty uncommon. But we see this kind of character switching model happening more often these days. For example, with God of War Ragnarok, playing as both Kratos and Atreus, and Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart, you played as Ratchet and Rivet. Spider-Man 2, you played as Peter and Miles. All of that kind of stuff. This happens pretty often these days. But since Rebirth's combat system is already kind of based around a party where you play as other characters freely during combat, it does this character swapping method in a really unique way, especially because there's so many different party members. In the open world, in story missions, you're typically playing as Cloud, walking around and doing that kind of stuff. But to put a spin on this and, put a spotlight on each character individually, Rebirth has one extended gameplay segment where the story, free roaming, and combat are all focused on a single character. This often comes at a key point for those characters within the story and offers a unique gameplay element along with it. So this is typically giving you, showing you a challenging time emotionally for a character or highlighting some sort of past trauma that the character needs to work through. For example, with the gameplay elements, it's interesting that Red 13 had his wall run, Tifa had a grappling hook, Aerith had the time puzzles to move the different places of the Cedra Temple. I love these portions of the game from both a story and a gameplay perspective. The highlights of these chapters for me, though, were Tifa and Red 13's. These are, again, coincidentally, my favorite party members from a character perspective for the game. I love Cloud, and then Tifa and Red 13, I felt in Rebirth, were really built up to be these great party members. I felt like both of these spotlight missions were very natural in the story when they appeared, which really helped me, get into them as easily. Starting with Red 13, I really want to talk about how I enjoyed playing with him and that wall running mechanic. I thought it was kind of nifty. And I was most excited by this story and of his trials of becoming a Watcher of the Veil, and also learning more about his past and his family. It really nestled perfectly into the Cosmo Canyon missions that were happening there in the story there. I thought that Red's past was such a sad story, but it really made me feel like I was growing closer to that character. And the same could be said about Tifa. Hers takes place during the Gongaga reactor mission, where her, Yuffie, and Aerith go to the Gongaga reactor to rescue the other party members. I felt like this mission had such a high sense of urgency, and you got to traverse around the Gongaga with a really interesting way, whether it was the grappling hook or first getting access to the chocobos who could bounce on those mushrooms. It was really interesting, and that ended with a really cool fight, and it concluded with a really impactful story moment for Tifa after Cloud having to push her into the water. So much like with Red, though, this you had these really strong story beats that were directly connected to the characters that you're playing as. The mission I struggled the most with, these character spotlight missions, was Kate Sith, simply because I didn't play with him very often. But I did enjoy, the box storing mechanic and all that with the Moogle and rolling around with him. Overall, I really love these character spotlight missions, and I hope that they're, incorporated into the next game in this trilogy. The next thing I wanted to talk about were minigames. There are so many minigames in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I really enjoyed most of them, and they are incredibly diverse, and it would take, a whole 2 hours to talk about all of them in depth. But what I really want to do is spend time talking about my absolute favorite of the minigames in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and that would be Queen's Blood. Oh my god, Queen's Blood. This is the best, in my opinion, in-video game that I've ever encountered. I'm a big fan of the card game Marvel Snap, and this game reminded me of a lot of Marvel Snap. but also was different in a very unique and wonderful way. I love building new decks with the characters that I continue to accrue. And for me, with Queen's Blood, I typically focused on decks that boosted my power rather than doing any of the, destroying other cards or destroying my cards and all that jazz. Anytime I saw the opportunity to do a new Queen's Blood match, I jumped on it right away because I thought the format of the game was clever. It was really engaging and thought-provoking and just really, really fun to play. I kept coming back to these quests for the amazing gameplay, but was also wrapped up in the fantastic storyline that they had associated with this. And it kept a nice amount of mystery going as you're playing these individual games. And, between that story and getting a new card each time you played someone and getting new cards from vendors, I was always ready to, keep getting back to Queen's Blood and keep ranking up, achieving the next Queen's Blood rank. I feel like I should move on from Queen's Blood now before I talk about it for another hour. But I would love to see some sort of mobile or physical version of Queen's Blood. And it could even have like a card collecting component. I don't know. It'd be kind of cool. Maybe it could import your collection from your Rebirth game. I would definitely play that. But I thought that one thing I do want to say about the Queen's Blood before I move on from it is that the end of the quest was a little less dramatic than I was expecting. But it was still enjoyable. And again, easily my favorite bit of side content in Rebirth. I do want to talk about the proto-relics. I thought that these were really fun. I didn't quite know what was happening with them when I first started in the grasslands. Was the proto-relics. I really enjoyed it, and I, to be honest, as I mentioned, haven't fully beaten it yet. I really liked exploring what each new quest in each region would be and slowly piecing together what would happen. And while I really enjoyed the story, the different things you were doing were kind of a mixed bag for me, and I wanted to just go through each of them and talk about my thoughts, just for a quick second on each of them. I thought that the mission with Beck's Bandits was really fun in the grasslands, and it kind of eased you into this concept, the format that these missions would take. And it also connected really well back to Remake, which I thought was really fun. Junon had Fort Condor, and I absolutely hated it. I was so bad at Fort Condor that my wife actually had to beat 2 of them for me of the 4. I had played it minimally in the Yuffie's Intermission DLC. I didn't love it there, but I especially did not like it here. And it could be a me thing, absolutely, without a doubt. But it was definitely one of my least favorite. I thought that the Kid G Cactuar challenges in Corel were my absolute favorite. I liked that they split them up so you got to kind of experience some of them, then come back to them. Gongaga had the Turk's Training, which I thought was I liked. It was okay. In Cosmo Canyon, it had what might be my least favorite gameplay wise was Gears and Gambits. I just thought there was so much going on. I saw this person on Reddit recommend, I wish I could remember what the username was, but recommend just getting low cost bots and just spamming them, and it worked, and I didn't have to think much about Gears and Gambits. But one thing I did love about this was the story closure for Tifa and Barrett with Avalanche. I thought that was a wonderful way to incorporate them in this story. In Nebel, we had the quest where you follow the Black Robes around, which I liked. And then in the Meridian Ocean, to round it out, the stuff I haven't beaten yet was the rather absurd 2 summon fights where you need to be in the 60s or 70s in terms of rank to even be able to tackle these. Again, I really struggled with this. My level was probably, in the 50s when I beat the game. And in past the point of no return in chapter 13, you do pick up a double XP materia, which will help you level up faster to take this on. So I do hope to, do some stuff, maybe Chadley missions with a double XP materia, and, hopefully beat this. I am aware of what the reward for this is, through looking up tutorials online and whatnot. I kind of spoiled it for myself, so I won't say what the reward is if you have yet to beat it, but it does seem pretty nifty. 2 more things I wanted to talk about before we move on to the story of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. The first is side quests. There's not a specific one that I really want to point out, other than the fact that most of them are actually quite good and provide you motivation to continue doing side quests. Something that's present for all the side content, but especially that I liked here was seeing the dots move along to indicate, your progression through this side quest. Some of them, you might want to be over sooner than others. So it was nice to say all right, I only have to do 2 more things for this, and then I can kind of move on. And, that was kind of nice. The overall, I really enjoyed the quest that they had here, and much like my thoughts on the proto relic quests, the side quests range from really good to just kind of okay. There were only a few that stood out as not being enjoyable, which I thought was still impressive for the massive size of this game. I did want to say my favorite side quest was the one with Salmon and Under Junon. I love dogs, and anytime there are dogs in video games, I tend to really enjoy it. The last thing I want to talk about before jumping into story was music. I am, if you've listened to us for any amount of time, know that I'm a big Star Wars fan. And music is such an important part of Star Wars, and, getting the feeling for it and everything, and, really accompanying the story really well. And I was shocked how much the music of this game left an impact on me. Upon starting Rebirth, especially when you first leave Calm and enter the Grasslands, I found myself, kind of like loving the music and really being, moved by it. And I didn't necessarily think I was so attached to any of the music from the first game. And much like Star Wars, as I said, I began to quickly identify different character themes that I didn't expect to remember from Remake. And it really enhanced my attachment to the characters and my enjoyment of the story. I only have one negative comment on the music for this game, and I really feel bad because I'm kind of beating up on Gongaga, but as you're trying to go through this maze-like region and get everything done that you need to in order to move on, with the Gongaga music, not the Chocobo one, but just the main music when you're free roaming in the open world for Gongaga, it was just very grating for me. But that's a minor detail. We don't need to harp on that too much. With that, I clearly really enjoyed all of the gameplay elements in this game, and you're not going to spend this much time playing a game if you don't like all the gameplay elements, and I thought they really did a good job of combining different things in terms of, world exploration and having kind of different tiers of side content to do. And I really enjoyed it. Now I want to go into the story. Start out by what my plan to do is to talk about the story here. I want to talk about my format. This is obviously a very large game with a very complex story, and my plan is to summarize the story and add my thoughts as I move through. I'm going to start by describing exactly what we see on a plot level, and at the end, we're going to kind of talk more about the multiple timelines business that's going on, as it really can get pretty confusing. I do want to say, if you haven't played the game and are looking for a thorough description of the story, I hope this will, tell you everything you need in as concise a way as possible. And if you've gotten this far, you are aware that it's a spoiler review. But I do want to again say, if you have not played the game and intend to, or are working through it, I would recommend that you pause, play the game, beat it, and come back later and watch. But with that, if you are prepared to hear about the story, I'm going to, again, kind of go in, summarize it, and then we'll talk about some of my thoughts on the third game afterward. So we start at a prologue where we cut to Zack reaching Midgar with an unconscious Cloud in his arms. And we know from Remake that this is taking place in an alternate world from the main game. And anytime we see a new world in this game, it's presented with a stamp, the Shinra dog mascot, as being a different dog breed. This world that Zack is in is ending because of Mako depletion, and we can tell that the events are taking place after what would have been the events of Remake in this world, because we can see our main party, including Red, being captured. We get to play as Zack, fighting to save an unconscious Aerith, and we see a white materia fall out of her hair as we get our title screen flashing. This obviously is picking up from the reveal that Zack, who is killed in the original Final Fantasy VII, is in fact alive in this world adjacent to the one that our characters exist in. So we have an unconscious Cloud, an unconscious Aerith in this world. And I do want to say, in the last game, Aerith is kind of able to sense Zack as he's walking past her in this alternate world, and it really gets into, kind of what might be happening with Aerith here, but we'll wait and talk about that. So after we see that, we head into our actual main game here, and we start with these Nebo flashbacks. Cloud and the rest of the party are at the inn in Calm, and Cloud is recounting a story detailing his past with Sephiroth. This is when they went to investigate the reactor at Mount Nebel, and there we get our main combat tutorial for the game, and we learn more about Cloud and Tifa's past. I thought it was interesting to see, Cloud's mom, Tifa's dad, and all of that, and where they actually grew up together. And I really, really enjoyed the narration dialogue of the present-day characters as this past events were happening. For example, Tifa gets annoyed with Cloud when he went through her room, and you had the option to say, "Oh, did I go through her closet or not?" just thought that was a really fun way to kind of work at this past story and still be connected to our present day characters. And I feel like little moments like this, where they give you little shreds of details on the characters themselves, were constantly in this game, and they add up to make you feel incredibly close with the characters. It's something I keep saying. You feel like you're really building a relationship with these characters, which is a hallmark of a successful game. As you move through the reactor mission, you even get to play as Sephiroth, which I thought was kind of crazy, and it felt like a fan-made mod. So it was really exciting to play as him. And you eventually return to Nebel. And in Shinra Manor, Sephiroth is doing some reading on like what his origins might be. And he goes insane after he discovers them. He does this because he finds out he was made in a lab through experiments with Genova's cells. And he burns the town down, killing Cloud's mother and likely everyone there. And he actually directly kills Tifa's dad and even severely wounds her. These events set up the rest of the game and presumably the next game. And interestingly, after that point, Cloud has no recollection of what happens next. After this flashback is finished, we also see Tifa and Tifa tell Aerith that Cloud is not actually present for these events. And she's not really remembering. She doesn't think he's remembering this correctly or even at all. And this kind of calls into question everything that happens in the rest of the game. The next day, after this story is told, Shinra attacks Calm, which is followed by the party's escape, and they decide to follow the Black Robes, which are the former Shinra test subjects that have Mako poisoning or some sort of Sephiroth juju going on. And Cloud believes that if they follow them, it will lead them to Sephiroth. This leads them all around into Under Junon, where they meet Yuffie, move into the city of Junon. In the city of Junon, we learn that Rufus Shinra has plans to find the Cetra Promised Land, and that kind of builds on the story, and it allows you to also participate in a fun parade minigame. My favorite part of that was gathering all of the 7th Infantry and hearing their funny chants while you run around, and I also like Barrett's sailor disguise. But we actually see our characters get to talk to Rufus Shinra, and he offers to call off their, them being wanted if they're able to go kill Sephiroth. But this is interrupted by Yuffie, who attempts to assassinate him. That then leads to that deal kind of breaking off. And following those events, the party heads to Costa del Sol on the cruise ship, the Shinra 8, again following the Black Robes. I was expecting the Shinra 8 portion to either, be a quick cutscene that gets you to the destination, or in typical Final Fantasy fashion, a battlefield experience. What I was not expecting was a Queen's Blood tournament. I already went on about how much I absolutely loved that minigame. So to see it put here front and center in the story was just absolutely fantastic. I thought it was amazing. And it also treated us to Red 13 and his pizzazz walk that he was doing in his Shinra uniform. So that's all done. Wonderful. You do have some combat there. But when we arrive at Costa del Sol, we're treated with one of my favorite aspects of this game. And this aspect happens here. It happened on the Shinra 8. It happened at Calm. And it'll continue to happen at the Gold Saucer and other places down the line. And this is that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth gives you so much time to slow down from the hectic and often heavy events of the main story. And, really get to spend time with the characters. It builds up a sense of the characters', day-to-day interactions and relationships, rather than simply just being a bunch of people who are fighting together and moving through the story at breakneck speed. It's one of the most special aspects for me of this game, and I loved every time the opportunity to slow down with our characters came up. I also loved the funny aspect of kind of living in a resort for a little bit with these characters, and even having to change into beach attire. Costa del Sol actually reminds me of the Sandals Resort that my wife and I went to our honeymoon on in Jamaica, and it was interesting to basically play through that. And one thing we're introduced here is the fact that Aerith's white materia is entirely empty. This is a materia that she had, and we, eventually later in the game learn that comes from her mother in a flashback. And this materia is empty and non-functioning because the Whispers stole the memories out of it anytime the party tried to defy fate. If you recall, in Remake, these ghost-like Whispers, anytime the party tried to do something that wasn't destined to happen, they would, try to stop it from happening. And anytime that happened, they would basically continue to make Aerith's white materia less and less functional. Yuffie here also formally joins the party. And again, like I said, I love the DLC. I really enjoyed playing as her throughout the game and throughout the DLC previously. And, getting to see her and her interactions with the party were really entertaining. Specifically, her and Barrett having low patience for her, and Cloud kind of, teasing her. It was really entertaining. So here, after we have Yuffie join our party, we shift back to the perspective of Zack for the first time since the very, very beginning of the game. That's actually quite a substantial amount of time, and I was starting to wonder why he was on the cover of the game. And, you ultimately start to realize that, but it did take quite a while to get back to playing as Zack again. So Zack here is hiding in a building with an unconscious Cloud and Aerith, and Aerith's mom, Elmira, comes wanting to check on the two of them, and ultimately decides to bring them back to her home. So that's what we see next with Zack is, him kind of moving Cloud and Aerith back to Aerith's house, and then we leave him again. And as we're leaving Costa del Sol with our main party, we get to learn more about Barrett's backstory by moving through Corel, where he's from. We also here get to see the terrible state that Shinra leaves the planet in. So we see an abandoned reactor where there was an explosion that we later find was directly involved, or Barrett was directly involved in. And this is where we get our first sight of the weapons, which are these whale-like creatures that the planet produces to protect it from danger. For example, like when the planet's Mako is being depleted. And after this area, we move into our first segment at the Gold Saucer. I've talked about the downtime and all the slowing down with our characters, and this is another way to do it. And also introduces us to some fun mini games and gives us fun little Queen's Blood puzzles that are, building on our existing mini games. And this is one of my favorite parts of the game because of this that I mentioned. During my first free roam here in Chapter 8, which is when you see this, I was actually alone. I, was kind of breezing through side quests at first and not really doing too many of them with the intention of, going back eventually. But I saw Red, after I was leaving my door, but I didn't get to do anything with him until the combat arena. And I didn't figure out that you were even supposed to have someone else with you at this point until I saw my wife playing this portion of the game, and she had Tifa with her. I believe that the formal term that they use for this is that this is a companion, where what happens later in Chapter 12 would be a date. Anyway, I enjoyed exploring the Gold Saucer. And after you're done kind of, having a fun time at the Gold Saucer, we're introduced to who we later find out is Dine, Barrett's best friend from his home. He had killed a Shinra officer at the saucer, and based on his physical description, Barrett is accused of the crime. At this point in the story, I didn't really think that Barrett would do something like this, but as I mentioned, I haven't played the original game, and I had watched some summaries, but this didn't really stick with me, and I really couldn't imagine that there was another person with a gun arm running around. And boy, was I wrong, because it does find out that it's Dine. But before we really find that out in the story, we catch up to Barrett, and Barrett ends up having to battle Dine, and we have to move through that area under the Gold Saucer to get through that. And after doing it, catch up with Dine, and we learn more information on his background with Barrett, how Barrett lost his arm, and that Marlene is actually Dine's biological daughter, which I thought was really interesting, and I'm excited to see how that's followed up on in a later game. After, beating Dine and after having an encounter with Shinra, we have Kate Sith fully join our party as a fully playable character. And, you get access to this cool buggy that I had mentioned previously, and the buggy allows you to traverse Corel. And I thought it was interesting that you could kind of actually take that back to the jungle region in Corel as well. So it was a nice, fun little gameplay addition that made exploring the open world just a little, a little more exciting, diverse in that region. This then is where we switch back to Zack for our third time in the game. This is where we have Marlene talking to Zack about how everyone's leaving her, and she wants to see Biggs, who's the only former member of Avalanche that is either alive or uncaptured at this point. So Zack sets off to find him, moving through the Sector 5 Undercity, and he eventually finds him, which is where we switch back to the main party, of course. So we still are kind of unsure what exactly is going on with Zack here. But after this, we end up in Gongaga. And I once again really do want to mention how much I dislike the music in Gongaga. But anyway, we meet Sisane, who we later learn is a former Turk, and the villagers of Gongaga, including Zack's parents. And when asked, Cloud says that he doesn't remember Zack, which we know and Aerith and Tifa suspect isn't true. Following that, the male members of the party go into the Gongaga reactor in order to investigate the whispers and other odd things that are happening there. As we move through it, we end up playing as Cloud as these party members are surrounded in an overwhelming battle with Shinra, led by Scarlet, who is, one of the odder characters in this game. But we then transition to playing as Tifa, moving through that similar area where you were. And that section ends with a climactic battle against Scarlet to save the others. And after we see kind of, beat Scarlet, move through, we see Sephiroth, whatever's going on with Sephiroth in Cloud's mind, kind of polluting his mind, making him do things that he wouldn't necessarily want to do. This causes him to push Tifa into this pool of water or Mako in the reactor. And this is where we see something really interesting happen for the first time. We see Tifa kind of move through the life stream and see some events of her past from different perspectives, some of her interactions with Cloud previously. But we also see the Whispers. We haven't talked much about them. The Whispers appear, as I mentioned, when someone's attempting to defy fate. We see those standard ones appear, but we also see a darker gray or black Whisper with purple lights in the middle in their hood portion. And these are directly controlled by Sephiroth, which I thought is interesting. I'm not sure how Sephiroth gets the ability to control these. But Sephiroth tries to kill Tifa, but she's actually rescued and released by the planet's weapon after being, encased in the giant materia-looking belly of the weapon. Following this, the party decides to head to Cosmo Canyon, and this is where we meet Sid, who flies them there, and we get to go and learn more about Red 13 and his home. And at Cosmo Canyon, we learned so much about Red, or as we come to know, Nanaki. I was pretty skeptical of Bugenhagen, who we meet, who is clearly very close with Nanaki at first, and the whole of the Cosmo Canyon, everything going on there. But we eventually learned to understand their perspective and why they behaved the way they did. This story portion represents one of my most favorite parts of the game, though, and this is when we learn about Nanaki's backstory. It was really emotional, like I mentioned earlier, learning about his parents, and it again made me grow to really have him be one of my favorite characters from this point forward in the game. And after we learn about that, the party is taken to a place outside of the planet by the Yi. This is the race of people who attacked Cosmo Canyon previously, then, had resulted in Red 13's parents dying. And the Yi also battled the Cetra, as we later eventually find out. As you're traveling with the Yi, on a boat, we transition back to playing as Zack again. Here we finally see Zack talking to Biggs, who seems to be, much like Zack, kind of taken from a different world, the world of the main game. And they both talk about being, given a second chance, being swept away by Whispers, or, basically being out of where they should be. And Biggs is still hoping to undertake Avalanche's missions in the world. So they go on a small recruitment mission that Biggs had set up, which doesn't really end up being productive. Zack returns to Elmira and Aerith's house to check on everything. And as he is interacting with Aerith in that world, again, emphasizing this is a separate world, Zack touches her hand. We then cut back to the Aerith in our party, who's actually able to feel like something touching her hand through the life stream. This is a really key moment that I want to talk about later on in my thoughts on what could be in store for the next game, or even kind of explaining some of the events of this game. But anyway, we're back with the main party, and when we reach the Gi encampment, we learn that the Gi aren't born of the planet and thus can't die and return to the life stream. And because of that, they want to find this materia that was taken from them by the Cetra, the black materia, and they created this through their bitterness and hatred, and they wanted to do that to end themselves. And it's likely that they do this through destroying the whole planet or something crazy. So the party, with no intention of actually giving it to them, agrees to help them find the black materia. And this is likely because Cloud has a vision indicating that Sephiroth, wants the black materia. To find the black materia, however, Cait Sith suggests that they should return to Nebel in order to find a Shinra terminal. And this seems to kind of confuse our party members based on the events that happened 5 years prior, again with Sephiroth burning down that entire town. Once they get there, they find out, though, that Shinra rebuilt the entire town and is using it as a treatment center for the black-robed individuals. And it's kind of strange because they actually rebuilt every building just as it was, as if nothing had ever happened, which is, kind of creepy and a little unnerving. As the party is venturing through Nebel, Cloud kind of has a flash of memories and tells Tifa that he actually remembers Zack and remembers that he was there with them 5 years ago, which again kind of leads us to some confusion where we can't necessarily trust what Cloud is saying and everything. And Cloud basically tells Tifa that she should talk to Aerith about this. And later on, we find that this conversation may, have kind of happened, but they both kind of deny it. So we don't get much closure on that after this point. But basically, Cloud is kind of starting to potentially piece together what's going on. But they ultimately, are able to access Shinra Manor's terminal with the reluctant approval of Vincent Valentine, who is also not a fan of Sephiroth. And I did want to say, during the Cloud portion of this, Cloud, Tifa, and Yuffie, we see the Shinra Wutai war starting to accelerate. It's likely a staged event, and we'll talk kind of about that later. But we start to see this Shinra Wutai war starting to happen, which could play a role in the third game. So while Cait Sith is working to find the location of the Cetra Temple that contains the black materia, Cloud is drawn into this room where he has one of his trademark Cloud glitches. And since I've been focusing on the story to this point, I want to use it to talk about Cloud's. I've been focusing on the story and kind of not talking about some of the intricacies. I do want to talk about Cloud's rapidly declining mental state throughout the game. He begins pretty lucid and fully in control of his actions, and throughout the game moves into losing control of his faculties and even doing things later on in the game that he definitely, if he was in his right mind, would not do. But anyway, Cloud has his kind of glitching into this portion of like a lab area, and Vincent isn't happy that Cloud's wandering. So you end up having to fight him, and as you move in, Cait Sith essentially finds that they know the location of the temple, but they have to find a keystone to gain entry to it. And as you're preparing to leave Nebel, Vincent actually decides he's going to come with you. He doesn't join your party quite yet or at all in this game, but he and Sid sort of serve as important characters that are traveling with the party but aren't yet quite in the combat party. I anticipate that will happen in the third game because that happened in the original game. As you're going there, you kind of find that the airplane that Sid is flying breaks, and you end up getting a boat. They end up turning the plane into a boat. And I just thought it was kind of crazy that at approximately like 3/4, maybe even more of the game being complete, the game gives you an airplane turned boat that allows you to travel directly through the water to each of the different regions. It was very cool and unlike anything I've experienced in a game. So at this point, we once again shift back to Zack. And he has a discussion with Marlene, who here seemingly knows that Aerith wakes up, that if she wakes up, she'll die at the hands of Sephiroth. This is likely some sort of communication with Aerith, because she's able to kind of transfer memories between people and clearly has an enhanced sense of what's going on. Zack decides that he needs to do something. And he's kind of positioned in this decision where he can either save Cloud, Aerith, or Biggs after reading a note that Biggs is going to bomb a Shinra facility. So following that, we shift back to our main party at the Gold Saucer. There we learn that the saucer's custody rights are up in the air, with Don Corneo, of course, who else, from Remake, attempting to make it Corneo Land. And we get to then, learn about this, know what's going to happen the next day, but we that night get to go on a date with a party member who synergized most with Cloud during that playthrough. I got Tifa, which I thought was nice and kind of like a very natural progression of their relationship over the last two games, and starting even from when they were children. And I hope this, for me, is the story that they carry out and continue to build on in the third game. I did, however, watch each date's Ferris wheel scene, and there's something to love about each of them. My favorite amongst the ones I didn't get were watching Nanaki get so excited about spinning the pod on the Ferris wheel. And there's also something really humorous about Cloud being trapped in a Ferris wheel with Sid, Vincent, and Cait Sith, with Cait Sith really being the only one who wants to be there. One thing I love about the date, and something that happened in Cosmo Canyon with the Proto-Relic quest, is that it provided some closure for the Avalanche team members that didn't make it out of the events of Remake. This included seeing Jessie in her dance as part of the Loveless, and seeing, after Aerith is done singing, seeing them kind of as, in Star Wars terms, like a Force ghost. I want to talk about Aerith's song. The message of the song is about seeing her friends again, but she's unsure of when or how. And this is important. And I kind of want to talk about this after we, conclude the events of the game. After the date, however, you have the next day, you get to, the person you're on a date with is in your party, you pick another, and you end up winning custody back, not necessarily back, but you end up winning custody for Dio and allowing the naming rights to still be the gold saucer. But then you're quickly thrust into battle against the Turks. In a twist here, Cait Sith steals the keystone and gives it to the Turks. I wasn't quite ready for this, and I had really grown fond of the little robotic cat. And we know from earlier in the game that he's under the control of Reeve, who is on the Shinra board, but I was kind of under the impression that he was actually trying to help the party. Again, I had watched the events, a YouTube video of the events of the first game, or the original game, after I'd finished Rebirth, but it was all kind of, blurring together. It was a while ago. I was kind of, Cait Sith's betrayal isn't necessarily something that I had seen coming, despite even watching those summary videos. But it did kind of hit me hard, especially because from what I've, now know is that his betrayal was a little more like telegraphed and a little less, he was a little less nuanced in the main game or in the original game. So they kind of changed it for the better here to make you sad and upset when he does it. We're not quite done with him yet, but we'll move on for now. After a battle with the Turks, which you win, Rufus Shinra, also you have to battle him and end up winning. But Cait Sith, you end up catching up with Cait Sith, who is fully given the keystone to the Turks. That he tries to kind of explain his decision and how it's hard for him, and the party essentially decides to part ways with Cait Sith. And we then see the Turks take the keystone to the temple, but Vincent is actually able to track them. And this reveals the location of the Cetra temple to the team. Shinra wants to access this again because it's like they think it's the promised land, which it actually is not. Aerith knows this. But this promised land would be a location that has a high amount of Mako that they could manipulate for their own gain. The Cetra temple itself is really cool because it's kind of assembled from nothing into this enormous structure that has all these staircases and gravity puzzles that you learn as you play through it. And during the chapter where we play through the Cetra temple, we see Cloud take some increasingly dark turns. And even like throughout the game he's done this, but it happens more here. Echo Sephiroth's phrasing and the stuff he's saying and kind of become emotionally distant from the rest of the party. One thing that happens here is that each party member has to face a trial that directly relates to the struggles they faced in the past and kind of move through the past trauma. And it forces them to face their biggest fears and move past them. And I thought this was really nice and kind of rewarding us, the player, for understanding what the characters have gone through and have to continue going through and, showing that they're bigger and stronger than that, which I really enjoyed that aspect of this portion of the game. And after many, many, many battles with Fiend, Shinra, the Turks, and even a monster that's created by Sephiroth, the party reaches the location of the Black Materia. On the way there, there's also a mention that Genova was kind of instrumental in the destruction of the Cetra, which is, something that's just kind of mentioned, not focused on too much, but is still interesting. And I think something we could see potentially play more of a role later. But Aerith senses when they're looking at the Black Materia that they shouldn't take it, and even can tell that Cloud is kind of under the influence of Sephiroth and tries to tell him that it's a decoy. But he sees through that, removes the Black Materia from where it is, and as he does this, the temple kind of starts to fall apart. We do see all of the, named important Shinra characters escape. And the party is actually able to escape because Cait Sith appears and is able to physically prevent the trap that is, would cause the temple to fully collapse. He's able to physically prevent it from moving down and doing that. He apologizes to the team, and there's a pretty touching scene where he and his Moogle are motivating themselves to buy the party as much time as possible. And this is kind of interesting because it's like Cait Sith, there's got to be some sort of like artificial intelligence component to it. Like he's controlled by Reeve, but probably not him like a remote control car. So this Cait Sith is actually, putting himself out there to sacrifice it. And it's not just the same as like, wheeling a robot in. So I thought that was interesting character choice for him to basically know that he kind of, needed to do this to protect his friends. And when we get back to the party, we see a new copy of Cait Sith, which I was not expecting, but was very excited to see him and have him rejoin the party. And it seems as if he kind of has his memory. He said his body was but one of many. So hopefully there's nothing weird going on there. And he's actually now truly in alignment with the party. We find that Cloud had kind of snuck the Black Materia, even though everyone told him to leave it. And Barrett takes it from Cloud and attempts to throw it down into the depths beyond the temple. And after this happens, however, Sephiroth appears and is able to grab it. He and the Whispers create this kind of crazy black network structure. And Cloud is able to regain control of the black materia, but is drawn to give it back to Sephiroth. Tifa tries to tackle him to get it, which is actually successful. And Aerith picks it up and runs along one of these black structures, fighting Whispers all the while. Here you play as Cloud, who kind of creepily chases after Aerith with like a weird, waddle and speaking kind of creepy. She ends up actually giving the materia, saying that he needs to do what he needs to do, and Cloud hands the black materia to Sephiroth. The Whispers then kind of attack Aerith, and in an attempt to save her, Cloud jumps into the depths with her under the temple, where they're both falling. We then see Cloud, or at least in an offshoot world of where Zack is, where he's been playing. So we kind of see like Cloud start to wake up, essentially, and he's in the wheelchair where Zack had left him in that portion during the Zack portion of the game. And he's greeted by Aerith, this Cloud, who's acting a little odd and kind of seems to have a knowledge of like this impending dread. And after you walk through the streets of Midgar's Undercity with Aerith in this world that is kind of destined to be destroyed, we see this like tear in the sky. We see a floating black feather, and hear Sephiroth speaking to Aerith, saying, "This is where you're hiding." So the Aerith in this world actually gives Cloud a fully functional white materia to bring back with him to his world. And remember, this is significant because the Aerith in our party, in our main world, does not have a functioning white materia, as it had turned clear from the Whispers. This Aerith also tells Cloud that whatever happens, to not blame himself. This, again, really is one of the many times from this game and the last game that we've been kind of privy to the fact that Aerith knows what's going to happen. She has some sort of knowledge or some means of connecting to other versions of herself in the live stream, and she tends to know what's going on there. And while this is happening, we see Zack defying fate several times, generating new worlds here and there every time he makes a different decision, and we can tell that by seeing Stamp being a different dog breed in each again. He had the option to save Biggs, Cloud, or Aerith, and the only one where he doesn't encounter Shinra is when he chooses to save Aerith. And he does this, however, he sees Sephiroth, and he's obviously a little suspicious based on what Marlene had said about Sephiroth killing Aerith. And Sephiroth kind of uses the Whispers to send Zack into this mysterious all-white area where he sees yellow petals floating around the sky, which we know kind of represents something to do with Aerith. Cloud gets launched into a very similar area as he's falling, when he had fallen with Aerith. And he's surrounded by both white and black Whispers. He sees a lot of this kind of rainbow effect, around him, along with the flow of the live stream and other worlds with alternate events that could be happening to him and the people around him. And Sephiroth says to Cloud that this is the true nature of reality, and then the planet consists of multiple different worlds that are created each time fate is defied. And that these all need to go away because it's eventually going to, end with the end of all of them. And Cloud ends up returning to the planet and a new location, kind of this mysterious blue-looking forest, where he sees Aerith. He gives her the functioning white materia from the other world's Aerith, and she exchanges it with him for her empty one. She then runs off, and when Cloud tries to chase her, he's stopped by the white Whispers and eventually becomes unconscious. Cloud wakes up after being found by the other members of the party, who were looking for Aerith, and then they follow this path to a Cetra structure, and they know Aerith is inside of it, but they also hear Sephiroth and see a bunch of black Whispers. And at this point, I want to mention something I really haven't yet, because it isn't necessarily clear. Sephiroth's motivations are a little fuzzy at this point, but Sephiroth constantly brings up the phrase reunion and refers to death as homecoming. And now that what we know about the multiple worlds, we can potentially theorize that Sephiroth wants to reunite all of these fractured worlds, kind of thinking of these worlds as like, splinters of the timeline from Loki and the TVA. He wants to have the sacred timeline or something kind of like that potentially. But after fighting some Whispers, there's a large wall of them kind of coming, so it's stopping the party from reaching the temple where Aerith is praying. And the entire party then has to help... Cloud get in to reach Aerith, and Cloud ends up getting in. He walks up to Aerith, who's praying, and we have both color whispers trying to stop him. And as he gets closer, he seems to be kind of forced to raise his sword up as if he would strike her almost. He actually resists this and, pulls his sword down. But we see Sephiroth falling from the sky in that position from the original game where he's attempting to kill Aerith. Here, unlike the original game, we see Cloud seemingly able to stop Sephiroth from killing Aerith. But then we kind of have like a glitch sort of thing where Aerith still gets stabbed and the white materia falls out of her hair down into the water below the altar where she's praying. And this is really where the story kind of gets trippy, because we see these two different situations happening where Aerith isn't bleeding in one and is in another, and we're glitching back and forth between them. On one of them, she's kind of unconscious and fading into death, as you might expect, and as might be, in the original game. And on the other hand, she's kind of aware and talking to Cloud. It's almost as if Cloud himself is like split between two different realities. We also once again see kind of rainbow effects surrounding Aerith as Cloud lays her down. And I was, want to take a second and say I was really sad about this. I knew that this was a component of the plot of the original Final Fantasy VII. And I think for me, I tend to, if you've listened to us at all, I tend to think that killing off a character isn't necessarily the most, impactful thing to do with them. And it doesn't necessarily need to be there for the stakes. So I thought they might be playing around with this, especially with the concept of defying fate. But I kind of came around to them doing this and the way that they're moving forward with it, because I think they're doing something unique that might change our perception of what's happening when the third game comes out. But that also really didn't stop it from being very sad. And, kind of remembering back to the song that she was singing, it just, it was emotionally a lot. But moving forward with the story, when Sephiroth kills Aerith, the whisper wall that the rest of the party is kind of facing outside drops, and they're actually able to come in and see what's happened. They're all, really upset, and this launches into a really, really long multi-part battle against Sephiroth. It was really cool to see this fight happen because it used every character, and it required them to be used in combinations that you might not always use them in when you're structuring your own party or even throughout the story. And there are, really two primary actually story beats that really happen here in this fight that I really want to focus on. The first is Zack. This is where we kind of really start to understand why we might be seeing Zack in this game at all in the first place and what's happening with these worlds. We see Zack here, he's in this white area where we left him off. We see Cloud actually get sent into this area, and he's kind of standing still. And he, Zack's kind of like, oh, Cloud. And he's moving around him, and when he touches him on the shoulder, they're both transported to this space-like area together. And in one of my favorite parts of this game, one of the most unique things of this game, and something I really was not expecting, Cloud and Zack actually fight Sephiroth together, which is completely awesome. It was so fun to unite these stories and really get to fully play as both characters. I wish I got to, maybe do a little more combat with Zack prior, so I kind of knew what was going on and how he was playing, but that's a very minor complaint for how absolutely amazing it was to fully play as those two characters together and being your combat party. After a little while, though, however, Sephiroth is able to separate these two and send Zack into this decaying world, and he continues fighting Cloud. Zack's parting words to Cloud were, Cloud, save her. So that's kind of interesting because he knows he needs to save Aerith, but it seems like what might have happened was already done, so it kind of leaves some questions. But the rest of the fight prior to the next thing we're going to talk about focuses on switching between Zack, Cloud, and the rest of the party, each having their own locations where they're fighting Sephiroth. One thing I did want to say is as you're fighting with Zack in this kind of abandoned-looking church area, is that these little wards would appear, kind of as if Aerith was helping him, which I thought was really, really nice, like a really nice detail. And that, though, brings us to the next thing I really want to talk about, which is Aerith. So during Cloud's portion of the fight with Sephiroth, we see this kind of rainbow flash, bringing up this idea of the rainbow flashing again. Aerith appears along with the scenery for the fight changing to this white kind of spacey area. And here, Aerith, or the spirit of Aerith, or some other means allow these two to fight against Sephiroth together. And Sephiroth here admits to being surprised by this, which kind of highlights Aerith's importance in the game, importance to the story, and that she might have more power than we initially realized, and that she could play a more substantial role in the third game than she did in the events that happened at that time in the original Final Fantasy VII. I really love this. And after having to, mentally deal with seeing Aerith, be killed by Sephiroth, it was really nice to have her actively contribute through whatever these means are to help fighting Sephiroth. So it was really, I really loved that part. So between the Zack and the Aerith contributing to the actual fight here, I really, really enjoyed it. And this battle with Cloud, Aerith, and Sephiroth ends with Sephiroth laughing and fleeing. Aerith and Cloud kind of hold hands briefly before Cloud is sent back to his world, and Aerith fades into the life stream, kind of with that green glowing effect. We see Zack kind of fully prepared to die, as the world that Sephiroth had sent him to will soon end with this kind of like this solar flare looking thing. But we have this, again, a rainbow effect appear, and he's transported back into his original world, or a world that resembles it. And when we cut back to Cloud, we see our main party, after having, defeated Sephiroth, mourning Aerith's death. And Cloud, though, kind of seems to be slightly outside of this reality, because he has a moment alone with Aerith where he tells her to wake up, and she actually does. Aerith then fades into the life stream again with the green little dot effects. And this really does kind of poke a lot of questions it provokes a lot of questions for like, what might be happening with Aerith? Why are we seeing this kind of split situation where she's alive and dead, kind of in this kind of limbo situation? And why was she able again to contribute to that fight? But now so after that, we kind of cut back to Cloud being with everyone in the party. They're all sitting by a pool of water in the citrus structure, and they're all kind of trying to wrap their minds around what had just happened. And I know in the original game, there's a scene where Cloud has Aerith in the water, and it's not here. And I'm not sure what exactly this means for the main story, but I think it kind of furthers the idea that we're not quite done with Aerith yet, even though her physical story in this way has kind of come to an end. And as they're sitting here, Cloud has one of his glitches, and it's honestly kind of red in tint, where the other ones are kind of green. And Aerith is actually sitting right next to him, and she's clearly able to communicate with him. So the rest of the characters, though, are taking this really hard, especially Tifa, who's really upset. And as the party leaves, before we talk about what happens with the rest of our party, we cut to Rufus Shinra, who is being contacted by a man in a black robe named Glenn Lodbrok. This is someone from Wutai, and who's been stirring up trouble with the Shinra-Wutai war throughout this whole game. I've kind of omitted a little bit of that. But we find out that, and Rufus is able to, figure this out, that Sephiroth is actually, controlling Lodbrok, and that it's in order to distract Rufus from achieving his goals. So we see that. We learn more about, kind of foreshadowing the Shinra-Wutai war in the third game. We see the cut to the weapons, and they glow this bright light and push the whisper surrounding them away. And then before we cut back to our party, one more thing happens. We see Zack wake up in the church in Midgar, presumably again in his world, and he vows that if worlds could unite previously, they could again. And I really think this kind of sets up the events of the third game, but we'll talk about that in just a second. So Cloud, we end up with our party, and they're trying to fix the tiny Bronco, which is Cid's plane. We see Cloud sitting alone, and he's watching them try to fix this. And we can see Aerith with the group. She's with Barrett, Cid, and Kate Sith, who are trying to fix the plane, but she's not really interacting with everyone. We see Yuffie crying off in the distance, have Aerith walk past her. And we have Tifa and Nanaki are really clearly very emotionally struggling with this. And they're sitting together, and however this version of Aerith exists, she walks past him, and he can actually sense her. So again, this is the only indication we have that Cloud isn't kind of losing his mind here, but I think there is more to this Aerith situation, obviously. So we can cut back to Cloud, and he's kind of examining the clear materia that Aerith had given him. And he goes to put it back into his pocket and finds that it either turns into, or he somehow was in possession of, the black materia. He kind of has one of his little glitches and says, "The reunion," once again echoing Sephiroth. And he actually fuses the black materia with the Buster Sword and heads off to leave everyone on the plane, leave with everyone on the plane that's now fixed. However, though, when Cloud looks at the sky here, he, much like Aerith in that world that was being destroyed, says, "Don't look up." And he can see the same tear in the sky that was present in that world. But no other party member can. he says that the party needs to head north to find Sephiroth, and that he knows that because of Soldier's intuition, but we know that that's kind of likely him sensing Sephiroth like one of the black robes and moving towards him. Before boarding the plane, Aerith and Cloud have one more conversation. Aerith says she'll put everything in her prayers to stop the meteor, and Cloud says he'll stop Sephiroth, and that she needs to trust him, and that he promises to stop Sephiroth. This we know is kind of related to Sephiroth summoning a meteor to, wipe the planet in the original game, but that's kind of something that I believe, is going to happen in the next game. And then this game ends with Aerith watching the tiny Bronco take off and saying goodbye, and the phrase "no promises await at journey's end" appears on the screen. The first thing I want to talk about is that phrase. I feel like it really means that the events of the third game aren't set in stone, and we don't necessarily have to remain in the way that they happen in the original Final Fantasy VII, and the first two games in this trilogy are really setting that up to be the case. I kind of want to talk about my thoughts on the ending itself, though, before I dive into, briefly my thoughts on the next game, and then, wrap it up here. My thoughts on the ending were, again, as I said, I haven't played the original Final Fantasy VII, but I thought this ending was, intentionally, but it was confusing. The beats surrounding Aerith's death were much more indirect than they were in the original game, and it really, I think, could imply a larger role for her in the future. And Cloud's declining mental state, is kind of interesting because it makes you think like, oh, maybe he's losing his mind and picturing Aerith. But Red being able to sense Aerith kind of makes that seem a little less likely. So I think they're kind of, messing with that on purpose. And we even have the rest of the party, as, really indicated with the conversation with Barrett at the end, indicate that he's kind of losing some faith in Cloud. And overall, I really like the ending of this game a lot more than Remake. I felt like it gave me a clearer picture, though admittedly not very clear, picture of where we're headed for the next game. I now want to, close with talking about my thoughts on the next game. So again, this is going to be there are going to be 3 parts to this story. And I don't want to go too much into like the actual events. We kind of know from the original game what's going to happen. See, war with Wutai, the meteor, all of that. But I want to talk about 3 main things that are more directly related to the events of Rebirth rather than what will happen. The first is Aerith. We obviously know that she's important here. And we know that she has knowledge of what's going to happen. She seems to know she'll be killed by Sephiroth. She knows that she is going to be parting from her friends as indicated in the song. And this all kind of informs her decision on what's going to happen with the party and how she kind of leads everyone to go about what they're doing. And she also has knowledge of what's going on in the other worlds. She senses Zack. She knows she'll be killed by Sephiroth in other worlds. She feels Zack's touch from another world, and she's able to give Cloud the white materia from a dying world to bring to another. So I think Cloud attempting to save Aerith from Sephiroth could potentially be why we're seeing Aerith have these kind of otherworldly abilities. The fact that both Cloud and to a certain degree Nanaki can feel her presence, I think indicates that there's something more going on than, again, just Cloud being crazy. I know there's a lot of varying discussion as to what the rainbow effects that appear at the end of the game are and what they might mean. But for me, I feel like it has to do with this version of Aerith we see kind of living between the worlds, manipulating reality or the planet and life stream. And this, why else might Zack have fallen through that floor and be transported back? How are we seeing Aerith with a rainbow effect appear to fight Sephiroth? I think this could set Aerith up to kind of be, Cloud is kind of like this, or I'm so sorry, Sephiroth is kind of like this representation of like the dark forces trying to destroy the planet and everything, where Aerith could be the light force trying to stop that. So it kind of like elevates Aerith to be like as big of a good guy as Sephiroth is a bad guy, kind of is what I might think might be going on here. In the third game, I'd love to see this concept played with more. And I just have this inkling, and it could just be me coping, that Aerith may not be fully done and really could play a substantial role in the next game. And I again think about the lyrics to her song. Could she potentially actually even return to being alive? Who knows? The next thing I want to talk about is Cloud and Zack. We obviously see Cloud in a rough state at the end of the game. He's mentally broken, struggling with the loss of Aerith and being manipulated by Sephiroth. But I think we see here that Cloud has interacted with things in different worlds. And I think he can perceive things that are happening that other members of the party haven't, because they've not interacted with these different worlds. For example, we see the tear in the sky that Cloud can see, but no one else can. He can see Aerith. He was able to interact with Zack. And I think that transition, when Zack tapped him on the shoulder, between him being kind of like a statue and then actually being able to interact with things from different worlds, could it be Aerith meddling? Could it be the fate and all that jazz? But I think this actually, Cloud having touched different worlds might allow him to help, contribute to saving the different worlds or something to that effect. And I know in the original game, Tifa helps to clear Cloud's mind and remove Sephiroth's control. So I hope that happens. He has a clear mind, so he can be more in control of navigating this different world situation that I think he might have a new power over. And similarly, I think this is how Zack could enter the world of the main party, or do something where he's, aligning in this world. And, one thing I haven't kind of really mentioned is that Cloud's mind has really been manipulated, and in the original game we know that he essentially believes that he has Zack's memories. So that could be interesting to see Cloud discover as he's actually interacting with Zack himself. So I think that could be a really interesting direction of the third game. And the last thing is the idea of reunion. Obviously Sephiroth wants to either unite or destroy all the branching worlds. And I'm not sure what exactly I want to happen with this, but all that I ask is that it's a satisfying and clear ending to this amazing set of games. There's been a lot of confusing aspects to Remake and Rebirth, and I want to fully understand Sephiroth's motivations, the way the story ends, and really understand the multiple worlds thing. I think this game, Rebirth and Remake, have generated so many questions, especially with why this is all even happening in the first place. So I think I would really love to see more like very clear answers to that in the third game. And other than that, I just want to spend more time with these characters, and I'm already really itching to play the next installment of the game. As I mentioned at the beginning, I was kind of like, oh yeah, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is coming out. I'm excited. I, want to play it and everything, but now I'm going to be like really ready to go next time this one comes out. Like the next time a trailer comes out, I'm going to start losing my mind. One thing we do on Blue Shadow, especially with some of our Star Wars stuff, is we talk about some of the big ideas, important life lessons the story's trying to tell here. I think something that this game really does is highlight the importance of family and the importance of connection on, keeping you safe, stable, and, really keeping you in line. I think Cloud's relationship with the party is what's keeping him from fully delving into Sephiroth's control. And I think they really show the importance of and show you how these relationships are built up. One other thing I also wanted to talk about was the idea of fate and destiny. And I think this game clearly has a big theme about defying fate or defying destiny. And that could tell us, and I think the third game will be this more clear, but I think it can kind of tell us like nothing's set in stone, and that if you want something to happen, you're kind of the only thing that's stopping you from achieving that. The last thing I want to leave with is just my final thoughts on the game. And overall, I just absolutely, if you couldn't tell, loved this game. It's the most fun I've had in a long time playing a video game. I adore most of the single-player story games that I play, but it's often very streamlined. As I mentioned several times throughout my review here, one of the most special things that this game does is that it allows you to have time to do these goofy things and have all this like downtime with your characters. And that, in addition to having a phenomenal story, incredible combat, and many other great things, makes this one of the just best video games, in my opinion, that I've ever played. I know there are a lot of wonderful games coming out this year, but this, for me, is a strong contender for Game of the Year. I do want to say thank you to my wife, who I mentioned got me into Final Fantasy in the first place. She, I don't know that I necessarily would have played or even enjoyed these games so much. And I was honestly a little resistant, like I kind of mentioned with Final Fantasy 15. But now here I am. I have a Cloud and Tifa statue in the room that I'm recording in. So very big thanks to my wife. And with that, I'm not really into big into giving numerical scores on anything, but I absolutely love this game, and I can say without a doubt I would recommend it to anyone, and I cannot wait to see the sequel. With that, thank you so much for listening. I really hope you enjoyed. I know it's kind of a long one, but with that, I would love to ask that you consider subscribing, or leaving a review on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube. Feel free to check us out on YouTube. Our YouTube page is Blue Shadow, or give us a follow on Twitter at Blue Shadow Pod or on Instagram at Blue Shadow Podcast. As well, our Facebook page is Blue Shadow. We have, a different format for our show where we, kind of release things in a different way, and we are, focusing on new releases of stuff like Star Wars and Marvel movies, but we want to review video games and stuff like this more consistently. So if there's a video game you'd like to see, please feel free to let us know, and we would be happy to, give it a look and talk about it. So with that, thank you so much again for listening. I really appreciate it, and hopefully we'll see you next time.